in him.
Today we're going to be examining the miracle that Jesus performed that above all others set him squarely in the crosshairs of the religious leaders, that of raising Lazarus from the dead, once and for all proving that he had power over death. So today we're going to spend our time primarily in John chapter 11. So beginning at verse 1. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick, so the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling them, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this." So although he loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Jesus waited on purpose. Why allow this pain for his friends? Those of us who know the story know that Lazarus physically died. And even though he will rise again, in the in-between, there is incredible pain and incredible grief experienced by all those involved. See, Jesus knew God's plan. This was going to be another opportunity to prove that Jesus was God-man and that his power was beyond anything his disciples yet realized. Yes, his friends would experience pain, but it was needed to provide a great hope and increased faith. So continuing at verse 7. Finally, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." But his disciples objected. "Rabbi," they said, "only a few days ago, the people of Judea were trying to stone you. You're going back there again?" Jesus replied, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light." Going to Bethany would be dangerous. What was it that his disciples feared? Well, the last time Jesus had been in Jerusalem, he had escaped being stoned to death for blasphemy. But barely. The disciples could not yet appreciate the events that were about to take place leading up to Passover, or the fact that everything was happening according to God's plan, even resistance and hatred of Jesus. Jesus wouldn't be the victim of the hatred of men, but rather a willing sacrifice. No one would take his life from him. He was going to lay it down. His time to die wouldn't come until it was time. Verse 11. Then he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I'm going to wake him up." And the disciples said, "But Lord, if he's sleeping, he'll soon get better." They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant that Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him." Jesus' delay, as explained to him here, was for the disciples' benefit, which means that Lazarus' death was for their benefit, which also means by extension that the pain of grief and loss currently being experienced by Mary and Martha was for the benefit of others. What do you think about that? How might it cause you to respond knowing that God might choose to work through your life in sometimes very painful ways for the benefit of others? See, this story is really no different from Joseph's story. You remember the Old Testament? Joseph, who was enslaved and imprisoned in a foreign land for 13 years after being sold by his brothers, then saving his family from a famine that would have wiped them all out. His pain for their benefit seems unfair. Yet this too, though he may not have known it for many years, was for his own benefit as well. Yes, he became second in command of the land of Egypt. All right. But if God hadn't worked in his life as he had, he too would have in all likelihood perished with the rest of his family. So his enslavement and imprisonment were actually for his benefit. Stories like these remind us that we shouldn't be too quick to judge our circumstances. Only time will tell what God's purposes were and are. And then verse 16, Thomas, nicknamed Twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let's go too and die with Jesus." Now, most of us who have familiarity with the 12 apostles know Thomas as the doubter. I think a fairer title would be a pragmatist. Even in the face of certain death, what was Thomas's suggestion? That they go. What does this tell us about him? That he was incredibly loyal. He was one, yes, who believed things when he saw them for himself, much like many of us. Yet he was also incredibly loyal, and in this case, ready to lay his life down for Jesus. And so they accompanied Jesus to Bethany. Verse 17. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Mary and Martha in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." "Yes," Martha said, "he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never ever die." "Do you believe this, Martha?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I've always believed that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who's come into the world from God." Martha was convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. There is no doubt. But it still appears that she placed limits on what he could or would do. What does he tell her? He tells her, "Your brother will rise again." He also tells her that he has the power over death. But as the story progresses, it's obvious that she has no idea what Jesus has come to do for her family this day. She still doesn't understand his words. Verse 28. Then she returned to Mary. She called Mary inside from the mourners and told her, "The teacher is here and wants to see you." So Mary immediately went to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were in the house consoling Mary saw how she left so hastily, they assumed that she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if only you had been there, my brother would not have died." Mary was equally convinced that Jesus could have saved her brother. But she has a different reaction than Martha's. As Martha goes out to meet Jesus, Mary stays in the house. When Martha goes and says, "You could have saved my brother," Mary throws herself at Jesus' feet with the same. However, in her belief that Jesus was the Messiah, that he could have saved her brother, how does it appear that she might be feeling? Maybe resentful, bitter, certainly not hopeful. And I suspect most of us can relate. It's usually only on the other side of life's difficulties, when we have experienced a measure of relief and see God's solution, that hope returns. But Jesus wants so much more for us. True spiritual maturity is given evidence in our lives when our level of trust in God causes us to hang on to hope in the midst of crisis. Despair is a common condition for our sinful humanity, but its true purpose in the life of the believer is really just to show up our need for continued growth in our relationship with him, in our certainty of God's sovereignty, of his love and his goodness. These are lessons I confess that I still wrestle with at times, as I think the majority of us will until we finally come face to face with Jesus in heaven. Continuing at verse 33. When Jesus saw Mary weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Where have you put him? He asked them. They told him, Lord, come and see. Then Jesus wept. And the people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him? But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? Jesus was still angry as they arrived at the tomb, a cave with the stone rolled across its entrance. What was the cause of Jesus' anger? Well, this wasn't how the world was supposed to be. Sin has infected God's good creation and introduced into our experience evils that were not part of God's plan. Jesus was face to face with the enemy of humanity, death, and it made him angry. Jesus loved Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, just as he loves us. Well, the pain he saw in people's lives caused him to have compassion. The cause of that pain made his blood boil. This was not how life was to be experienced, and he was justifiably angry. Our anger often leads us to act in ways that are not pleasing to God, lashing out or brooding on the thing that has made us angry. But that's not what Jesus' anger led to. Verse 39. Roll the stone aside, Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes and his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. Jaw drop. I wonder if the majority of the crowd didn't think they were witnessing some kind of a zombie apocalypse. Jesus has to tell them to release Lazarus from the grave clothes. He's not a ghost. Get over there and help him. If you had been in the crowd that day, how would you respond? Maybe it's hard to think of a tomb. Well, then think of going to a cemetery and having somebody dig up a body. We would have been flabbergasted. So let's read their reactions. Verse 45. Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen. Such incredible eyewitness account. But verse 53 tells us that others went to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and told them, and this was their response. So from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. And then skipping over to chapter 12, verse 9 to 11, when all the people heard of Jesus' arrival to Jerusalem for the Passover, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. Then the leading priests decided to kill Lazarus too, for it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus. How do each of the characters of the story choose to respond? Let's begin with Mary and Martha. Their story begins with a plea for help. They're convinced that Jesus can heal their brother, but they're confused when Jesus allows him to die. Possibly they questioned his love for them. They still believed he was the Messiah, even during grief. And then when Lazarus is raised from the dead, they meet the experience with shock, followed by incredible joy. This dead and decomposing body of 4 days is now restored back to full health. How did they respond? With a faith that is expanded and cemented as to who Jesus is and what he can do. What about Lazarus? We don't hear a lot about his reaction, but depending upon how quickly he became sick and how quickly he died, there may have been some worry on his part for the welfare of his sisters. And remember, after 4 days, He came back to life, but where had he been during those 4 days? His body was in the tomb, but he was in paradise. And it's at this point, after having been there for 4 days, that he gets the summons to come back. That would have been hard. I just can't imagine. But in some ways, maybe he would have experienced some relief that his sisters would again be taken care of. I am certain that Lazarus was humble and in wonderment over being chosen to show God's power through his own death and life. His trust, how could it not be deepened as he recognizes that God knows best? And maybe he's just a little impatient to go back. The disciples, also in the story, were certain that they were about to die as they go to Bethany. But beyond that, they play the role of the audience along with the crowd and mourners. There's really nothing said about them, other than we know John is writing a first-hand account. And how many of the mourners were there simply in hopes that Jesus would come and perform a miracle by healing Lazarus while he was still alive? Some were touched by the deep grief that Jesus displayed, and others resented Jesus' late arrival. They had seen or heard about how he had given new eyes to the man born blind. Why had he not worked his magic for this family, who were supposedly his good friends? When Jesus ordered the stone away, did they simply assume he wanted to see Lazarus' dead body one last time, like a wig? We don't know, but what we do know is that they're all gobsmacked as Lazarus walks out of the tomb, maybe even fearful that they're seeing a ghost until Jesus orders them to remove the burial wrappings. All now have a choice to further believe that Jesus is who he says he is, and many do, or to turn informant for those who refuse to believe, which also happens. Some go to the religious leaders to report. The religious leaders themselves, they're left to wrestle with their own preconceived paradox. In their mind's eye, Jesus is a sinner. He heals on the Sabbath. He's the son of a nobody. They were convinced he did not fulfill the scriptures concerning the Messiah. Yet, opposite and equally true is this undeniable performance of this miracle of raising a man from the dead after 4 days. Their way of life is threatened. Their audience is going over to Jesus. And the Romans were likely to perceive this as a threat and to destroy this new rebellion, quote unquote, to the established order, punishing the whole nation in the process, or at least that's what they said was their concern. So the conclusion, Jesus must die. Not only that, Lazarus too, as a living, walking miracle and proof of Jesus' power, must die as well. The last ones that we need to consider the reaction to is ourselves, the readers. Will we relegate the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead to the status of a fairy tale, just some early church hyperbole? Or will we too allow it to strengthen our faith when we find ourselves in a place of desperation like Mary and Martha, or coming out of an impossible situation like Lazarus, or facing a threat to our very lives like the disciples? For those of us who believe the truth of the Bible, it should give us incredible hope, knowing that nothing is impossible for God to do on our behalf. And just as Lazarus was raised from the dead, no matter what we may experience on this earth, we too will rise to new life with him, because Jesus has the power over death.